The statutory notice period for a commercial eviction in this municipality was 30 days. The yellow-tinted document taped aggressively to the interior glass of the Coastal Bookstore's front door claimed to be a lawful notice to vacate. But as I stood on the cracked pavement in the damp, salt-heavy fog of the Tuesday morning, I noticed the mathematical discrepancy before I even finished reading the first paragraph. The issuing date stamped at the top was the 4th of the current month. The mandated vacate date printed at the bottom was the 31st. That was 27 days. I pushed my bare hands deep into the fleece-lined pockets of my charcoal wool overcoat, feeling the biting coastal wind slice at my neck. I was paid to protect high-net-worth commercial developers like Richard Sterling until his fake, mathematically defective notice landed on this specific door. I had driven 2 hours out of the city center solely because a prospective client had double-booked our meeting and relegated me to wait at the local independent bookshop until noon. I was tired, burned out, and entirely compartmentalized. I had absolutely no intention of looking at anyone else's legal problems today. The heavy brass bell bolted above the oak door chimed, a bright, clear sound that pulled my attention away from the defective yellow paper. The door swung inward, and the sharp, comforting scent of old paper binding, dark roasted coffee, and sea salt spilled out onto the damp pavement. A woman stood in the threshold, holding a chaotic ring of brass keys. Astrid Taylor. I knew her name only from the carved wooden sign swinging above the canvas awning. She was 36, wearing a thick cable-knit sweater and faded denim, her dark hair pinned up with a wooden stylus. When the last lingering customer of the early morning coffee rush stepped past me and walked down the street, she didn't exhale. She just stared at the yellow notice taped to her own door. Her fingers whitened on the key ring. The brass squealed under her grip. I'd seen that physical reaction, heard that specific sound, in dozens of sterile conference rooms right before someone got systematically crushed. Her landlord, Richard Sterling, wanted this entire historic block cleared out for luxury waterfront condos before tourist season began. And he was using a fake emergency clock to force her into a lowball buyout. If she vacated the building for even one single day, her grandfathered lease protections would automatically collapse, and the business her family built would permanently die. "The filing margins are wrong," I stated, my voice a quiet, measured baritone that cut cleanly through the sound of the crashing surf across the street. Astrid snapped her head toward me, her eyes narrowing instantly. They were a sharp, intelligent gray. "Excuse me?" "The structural margins on the document," I clarified, stepping out of the freezing fog and into the sheltered alcove. I pointed a gloved finger at the yellow paper. Under Section 402 of the State Commercial Code, a punitive notice of termination requires a strict 2-inch top margin for the municipal clerk's official stamp. This has a standard 1-inch margin. Furthermore, the timeline is short by exactly 3 days. It doesn't guarantee an automatic win, but a formatting defect like this is usually enough to stall the initial filing and force a real, scheduled hearing before a judge. Astrid looked at the paper, then back at me, her defensive posture remaining firmly in place. "Are you a municipal safety inspector?" "Nathaniel Miller," I said, offering a brief, professional nod, keeping my hands visible. "Corporate contract law. I have a client meeting in this town at noon, and my schedule was abruptly rearranged. I was hoping to buy a coffee and use one of your tables for a few hours. The legal observation regarding your door is free of charge." She studied my expensive suit, the pristine leather briefcase in my hand, and the complete lack of warmth in my demeanor. She simply unlocked the heavy iron deadbolt and pushed the wood wide open. "The espresso machine is notoriously terrible, and the local Wi-Fi is somehow worse," Astrid said, her voice dry and pragmatic. "But the tables in the back are dry, and they have power outlets. Come in before you freeze to death on my doorstep, counselor." I stepped into the Coastal Bookstore. The interior was a sprawling, beautifully arranged labyrinth of floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves. The ancient floorboards groaned a deep, resonant protest under my heavy leather shoes. It was a space built on decades of history, entirely disconnected from my sterile boardrooms. I walked directly to a small, circular wooden table near the back window, which offered an unobstructed view of the gray ocean. I unpacked my laptop, aligned my digital notepad perfectly parallel to the keyboard, and began answering high-priority emails. From my chosen vantage point, I had a clear line of sight directly to the main register. For the next 2 hours, I watched Astrid Taylor work. She recommended obscure historical titles to elderly locals, managed a delivery of heavy hardcover boxes using a rusted red hand truck, and fielded a relentless stream of vendor phone calls. but every time the shop briefly emptied, the composed facade cracked slightly. She would lean heavily against the wooden counter, rubbing the bridge of her nose, her eyes drifting unavoidably toward the yellow notice on the front door. At exactly 10:30, the vintage rotary phone resting on the main counter rang loudly. Astrid picked it up, her posture instantly shifting from relaxed to rigid. "Sterling," she said. Her tone dropped 10 degrees, becoming hard and fully armored. I stopped typing mid-sentence. "I received the notice on the door," Astrid said, her knuckles turning white again around the heavy plastic receiver. "You know perfectly well the commercial lease doesn't officially expire for another 6 months, Richard. You can't arbitrarily trigger a demolition clause because you want to break ground early." A long pause followed. I watched her close her eyes tightly, absorbing the threat. "I am not accepting a buyout for 20 cents on the dollar," Astrid fired back, her voice shaking with suppressed anger but absolutely refusing to break. "My grandfather built these shelves himself. This building is sound, and my rent clears the municipal bank every month on the 1st. You send a demolition crew before a judge signs an order, and I'll stand in the front doorway myself." She slammed the phone down onto the cradle with a sharp, violent crack that echoed through the quiet stacks. Elias, an elderly employee shelving biographies in the local history section, froze entirely. He looked at her with deep concern. "Did he mention the facade again?" Elias asked gently. "The city planner's office loves claiming old brickwork as a public hazard just to fast-track these developer buyouts. They did the exact same thing to the bakery on 4th Street last year. He said he has an engineering report," Astrid replied, pressing the heels of her hands against the edge of the counter. "He said he doesn't need a judge if the city declares it an immediate hazard." I looked back at my laptop screen. I was reviewing a massive merger acquisition for a tech conglomerate. It was lucrative, sterile, and entirely meaningless. I looked at the woman standing 10 feet away, fighting a multi-million-dollar firm with nothing but inherited grit. I closed my laptop. The metallic click echoed sharply in the quiet shop. I stood up, picked up my leather briefcase, and walked over to the main counter. I didn't ask her to explain how overwhelmed she felt. Empathy wasn't my primary tool. Leverage was. "Your master lease," I said, keeping my voice steady and strictly professional. "Where is the physical copy?" Astrid looked up, startled by my sudden proximity. "What?" "The commercial lease agreement you originally signed with Sterling Properties," I repeated, resting my hands flat on the edge of the counter. "Sterling uses a standard, highly aggressive boilerplate contract for all his coastal acquisitions. If you have the physical copy in the building, I need to see the exact wording of Section 8. She crossed her arms over her chest, forming a protective barrier. "I told you earlier, Mr. Miller, I can't afford a corporate attorney from the city. Sterling is intentionally trying to bleed my operating accounts dry with endless legal fees. If I hire you, I bankrupt the store anyway. I am fighting this myself. I am not asking for a firm retainer," I stated, my tone unyielding and focused entirely on the logistics. "I am asking to read the document. I fix broken contracts for a living. I read them fast, and I find the specific traps they bury in the text. Let me look at it." Astrid searched my face, looking closely for the catch. Finding nothing but cold certainty in my expression, she exhaled slowly, reached under the wooden counter, and pulled out a thick, battered blue folder. She slid it across the polished wood toward me. I opened the folder. The lease was 42 pages long. I bypassed the rent schedules and the boilerplate arbitration agreements, hunting specifically for the architectural termination conditions. I caught the mechanical trap within 3 minutes. "Right here," I said, tapping a buried paragraph on page 22. Section 8.4. The early termination for structural redevelopment. Sterling is claiming he has the right to evict you early because the building requires foundational upgrades. "He sent an engineer last week," Astrid said bitterly. "A guy with a clipboard who spent exactly 10 minutes in the basement and declared the main support beams compromised. It doesn't matter what his engineer said," I countered, uncapping my pen and circling a different line above it. "Look at the preceding clause. Section 8.3 explicitly states that any structural redevelopment initiated by the landlord requires a municipal zoning variance approved by the city council before a notice to vacate can be legally issued." Astrid frowned, leaning closer. "What does that actually mean for me?" "It means Sterling jumped the gun to scare you," I explained. "He issued the yellow notice on your door this morning, but I know for a fact the city council doesn't meet to vote on coastal zoning variances until next Thursday. He doesn't have the legal prerequisite completed to trigger the eviction clause. The entire demolition mechanism is currently dormant, the suffocating tension in Astrid's shoulders fractionally released. So, the notice on the door is invalid? It's enough to challenge the emergency order and force a neutral, third-party inspection, I confirmed, closing the blue folder. He expects you to panic, assume the incoming legal fees are insurmountable, and take the lowball buyout offer before he actually has to go through the expensive bureaucratic process of securing the real municipal permits. She didn't collapse in relief or start crying. She immediately began calculating the very next step. "How do I prove it to the city?" she asked. "If I just call him and tell him to go to hell, he'll send his own team of lawyers to drown me in injunction paperwork by tomorrow morning." "You don't call him at all," I said, mapping a step-by-step counterplan. "We draft a formal letter of dispute citing Section 8.3. We file a preemptive motion with the municipal clerk this afternoon. We can file the motion today, but the emergency hearing is what actually matters. We force them into a room first thing tomorrow. When his lawyers realize we've officially locked the legal mechanism on the public record, they'll have to advise him to back down or face a bad faith litigation suit." Astrid looked at me, her gray eyes piercing directly through my professional armor. "You keep saying we." I paused. I had said it. I was a strict compartmentalizer. I never involved myself in the physical execution of the defense unless I was actively billing $600 an hour. But standing in this quiet shop, looking at a woman who flatly refused to yield to a corporate bully, the strict separation between my job and my actual life suddenly felt hollow. "I have a portable printer in my car," I said smoothly. "I can have the dispute letter drafted, formatted, and ready for your signature in 20 minutes. Astrid didn't thank me immediately. She walked over to the vintage brass cash register, hit a key, and the heavy drawer popped open with a loud chime. She pulled out a crisp single $1 bill and set it deliberately on the counter between us. "I don't take charity from corporate lawyers, Nathaniel," she said, her voice a calm, unyielding boundary. She could end the arrangement at any time. The dollar wasn't a cute gesture, it was firm consent in her language. "This is my retainer. You work for me now. Strictly professional. Do we have a deal?" I looked at the dollar bill, a profound respect settling heavily in my chest. She wasn't a damsel waiting to be saved. She was a shieldmate calling for reinforcements. I reached out, took the dollar, and folded it neatly into my suit pocket. "I can only draft the dispute letter today," I said, ensuring the boundary was clear and leaving the power in her hands. "If you want me beyond that, you choose it day by day." "We have a deal, Miss Taylor." I pulled my phone out of my pocket. It was vibrating continuously, my noon client asking where I was. I typed a rapid cancellation notice and placed the device face down on the wooden counter. Let's go to work. For the next 4 days, the coastal bookstore became my secondary base of operations. I cleared my afternoon schedules, moving my corporate caseload to the early morning hours in the city before driving out to the coast. At 2 o'clock every day, I walked through the brass-belled door, the scent of sea salt and old paper instantly lowering my blood pressure. The domestic anchors of our forced proximity were entirely practical, yet they began to carry a quiet, steady weight. Every afternoon at 3, without asking, Astrid would place a ceramic mug of terrible, black drip coffee at the edge of my table. It was bitter and over-roasted, but I drank every drop. In return, when the shop grew busy and the line at the register backed up, I would quietly stand, take the heavy boxes of inventory from the delivery drivers, and stack them neatly in the back room so she wouldn't have to lift them. We rarely spoke during these exchanges. The respect was built entirely through acts of service. On Wednesday, the routine broke abruptly. My phone vibrated against the table, the screen flashing with Sarah's caller ID. My paralegal's voice was tight with professional urgency. "Nathaniel," she warned quickly. "Sterling's legal team isn't waiting for the clerk to process the dispute letter. They just tried to bypass the intake desk and file a motion to expedite a preliminary zoning hearing directly with a local judge. I blocked it with a temporary restraining order placeholder using the Section 8.3 argument. But they are incredibly aggressive. You have maybe 48 hours before they find another judge who will hear the motion." "Understood. Pull the judge's past rulings on commercial variances and fax them to the shop," I ordered, my mind racing through the contingencies. "Keep the TRO active at all costs." I hung up, rubbing the back of my neck. I looked up and noticed Astrid leaning against the far bookshelf in the history section. Her eyes were closed, her head resting against the mahogany trim. The exhaustion radiating from her was absolute. The ambient temperature in the shop had dropped significantly due to a rolling coastal storm, and she was shivering slightly in her thin sweater. I stood up, walked to the ancient brass thermostat on the back wall, and adjusted the dial upward by 4 degrees. Then, I picked up my heavy wool overcoat from the back of my chair, walked over to her, and draped it quietly over her shoulders. Astrid opened her eyes, startled. She looked at the heavy fabric now resting on her shoulders, holding my lingering warmth. "I'm fine, Nathaniel," she said, her voice rough with fatigue, moving to shrug it off. "The shop is freezing, and your core temperature is dropping," I stated, offering objective facts, not romance. "I don't need the coat right now. Keep it on." She stopped resisting. She pulled the thick lapels slightly closer together. She looked up at me, the sharp, defensive edge in her eyes softening into something quiet. "Your espresso is a clear violation of the Geneva Conventions, Miss Taylor," I noted dryly, breaking the heavy tension with a flat, deadpan delivery. A small, surprised laugh escaped her, breaking the silence in the aisle. "Then file a motion and arrest me, counselor." "I'm deeply considering it," I replied, the corners of my mouth twitching upward in a rare smile. She exhaled a long breath, staring at the floorboards. "Sterling's lawyers called the shop line again this morning," she confessed. "He said the injunction is just a delay tactic. He said he has the capital to drag this out until I bleed to death in court fees." "Sterling is a bully," I said, maintaining a polite, non-intrusive distance. "Bullies rely heavily on intimidation because their actual legal architecture is weak. The injunction holds the line. I'm so tired of fighting." "Nathaniel," she admitted, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled a printed copy of the buyout offer from her pocket. She stared at the signature line, holding a pen. It was a moment of profound, emotional exhaustion. She hovered the tip of the pen over the paper. "Sometimes I wonder if I should just sign it, take the 20% buyout and walk away. At least the waiting would be over." I felt a sudden, sharp tightening in my jaw. The thought of her surrendering her legacy to a predator like Sterling felt fundamentally wrong. I wanted to reach out, to touch her arm, to stop her hand, but I kept my hands firmly in my pockets, refusing to override her agency when she was cornered. She stared at the paper for 10 agonizing seconds. Then, her jaw hardened. She grabbed a thick red marker from the counter, wrote the words, "Disputed, pending litigation" in massive, bold letters across a blank shipping label, walked straight to the front door, and slapped the sticker directly over Sterling's yellow notice for everyone on the street to see. "You don't want to walk away," I said with absolute certainty, watching the fire return to her eyes. "No," Astrid said, her voice firm. "I don't. This shop is my anchor. We just need to reinforce the structural defense," I told her. "I am not going to let him break the lease, Astrid." She looked at me, really looked at me, seeing the unyielding conviction in my posture. "You're a terrifyingly stubborn man." "I am a highly effective strategist," I corrected mildly. "And you paid my retainer? I don't lose." The midpoint twist arrived with brutal, calculating efficiency on Friday morning. I was at my corporate office in the city, reviewing a merger, when my cell phone rang. It was Astrid. "He bypassed the lease entirely," she said, her voice tight, heavy with a grim reality. "A city marshal just walked out of the store. He served me with an official emergency termination of occupancy." I sat up perfectly straight. "That's legally impossible." "The injunction froze the structural demolition clause completely." "He didn't use the demolition clause," Astrid explained, the sound of tearing tape echoing over the line. "He used a municipal safety ordinance. Just like Elias warned, he filed a report claiming the external facade of the building is an immediate public hazard. The city didn't need a zoning variance to approve a safety hazard claim. They issued an emergency shutdown order. I have 48 hours to vacate the premises, or they board up the doors." Sterling had found the loophole. He couldn't legally evict her to build something new. So, he weaponized a municipal safety law to claim the current building was deadly. It was a cold, faceless denial generated by the city system. "Don't pack a single box," I ordered, my voice hardening into a lethal, focused calm. "I am leaving the city now. I will be there in 2 hours." When I arrived at the coastal bookstore, The bright yellow emergency shutdown notice was glaring against the front glass, positioned right next to her red sticker. Inside, the quiet resilience was completely gone. Astrid was standing behind the main counter, staring blankly at a massive stack of cardboard moving boxes Elias had reluctantly dragged up from the basement. The threat was no longer theoretical. The reality of the eviction was physically manifesting in the room. I dropped my briefcase on the table and immediately pulled out my laptop. I didn't offer a greeting. I initiated the counterplay. Sterling's claim hinges entirely on the assertion that the facade is an immediate public hazard, I said, my fingers striking the keyboard with rapid, aggressive force. To trigger an emergency municipal shutdown, he had to submit a certified engineering report to the city planner's office. Show me the paperwork. Astrid walked over, her face pale, and handed me the document. He did. The marshal left a physical copy. It says, "The mortar on the second-story brickwork is degraded beyond repair." I took the stapled report from her hands. I read the technical data, scanning the stress metrics and the material analysis. I was a contract lawyer, not an architect, but I knew exactly how to cross-reference corporate liability. This report was filed by Apex Engineering, I noted, pointing to the embossed letterhead. I opened a new browser tab, logging into the state corporate registry database. I typed in the name, tracing the LLC shell companies associated with the engineering firm. The screen populated with complex financial data. "Look at this," I said, turning the laptop screen toward her. Astrid leaned in, her arm brushing lightly against my shoulder. Apex Engineering is a subsidiary firm, I explained, tracing the line of corporate ownership with my pen. It is wholly owned by the Sterling Management Group. The engineer who certified this historical building as a public hazard is directly on Richard Sterling's payroll. Astrid's breath hitched audibly. "Is that illegal?" "It's a massive, undeniable conflict of interest," I stated, the legal trapdoor finally opening before me. Municipal ordinance requires independent, third-party verification for an emergency structural shutdown. By using his own subsidiary to manufacture a fake safety crisis, Sterling committed procedural fraud. The shutdown order is legally compromised. I looked up at her, my expression fierce. "We have the leverage to kill the eviction permanently?" For the next 10 hours, I didn't leave the small circular table. The sun went down, plunging the coastal street into darkness. But the warm lights in the bookstore burned bright. I drafted the countersuit, compiling the corporate registry data, the original lease agreements, and the strict municipal bylaws into an irrefutable, ironclad legal weapon. Astrid stayed with me. She brought me water, adjusted the ambient lighting so the glare wouldn't hurt my eyes, and managed the shop's closing duties in silence. At 2 a.m., my vision began to blur. I rubbed my eyes roughly. I felt a quiet movement beside my chair. Astrid set a fresh, steaming ceramic mug of coffee on the table. It wasn't the terrible drip coffee from the shop's machine. It was a pour-over, rich and dark, sourced from a specific roaster down the street. She had remembered a passing comment I made a week ago about my preference and had quietly acquired it for this exact, exhausting moment. "Drink," she said gently. I took the mug. The warmth seeped into my cold hands. I looked at her, realizing with absolute clarity that I was no longer fighting this case to protect a client. I was fighting it because I couldn't imagine a reality where this woman didn't have her sanctuary. I pulled out my personal leather-bound planner. I flipped to the next month, a calendar usually reserved strictly for court dates and corporate mergers. With my pen, I wrote her name Astrid on the first day of the month. Then I wrote it on the 15th. I wrote down her inventory delivery dates, treating her timeline with the same absolute commitment I gave my own life. It was a silent, practical yearning. I didn't ask her to shrink her life to fit mine. I was actively building my schedule to fit hers. Astrid saw the dark ink drying on the page. She didn't say a word, but she reached out and briefly, firmly touched my shoulder. A deep, resonant connection of absolute trust. "We meet Sterling at the city planner's office tomorrow at 9, I said, my voice rough with fatigue. "We end this." The municipal meeting room was a sterile, fluorescent-lit box, smelling strongly of stale floor wax and administrative indifference. Richard Sterling sat at the long conference table, flanked by 2 junior attorneys. He wore a bespoke suit and a supremely confident smirk, entirely assured of his victory. The city planner, Harrison, sat at the head of the table, checking his watch. Astrid and I walked into the room at exactly 8:59 a.m. I carried a single, thick manila folder. I didn't look at Sterling. I pulled out a chair for Astrid, waiting until she was securely seated before taking the chair beside her. "Miss Taylor," Sterling said, his tone dripping with patronizing sympathy. "I'm sorry it had to come to an emergency shutdown order. But public safety must be our primary concern. I have the buyout paperwork ready. If you sign today, I'll waive the demolition fees entirely." Astrid didn't flinch. She sat perfectly straight, her posture radiating cold, unyielding authority. She looked at me and offered a single, precise nod. I opened the manila folder. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't posture. I let the documentation do the violence. "Mr. Harrison," I began, addressing the city planner directly. "My client is formally contesting the emergency shutdown order issued against the Coastal Bookstore. We are filing an immediate motion to invalidate the structural assessment based on procedural fraud." Sterling's smirk vanished instantly. His junior attorneys sat up sharply. "Fraud?" Sterling snapped. "That report was filed by a state-licensed engineering firm." I slid a stapled packet of documents down the polished table toward the city planner. "The report was filed by Apex Engineering," I corrected, my voice a lethal, measured calm. "According to the state corporate registry documents provided in that packet, Apex Engineering is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Sterling Management Group. By municipal law, an emergency shutdown requires an independent, third-party assessment. Mr. Sterling used his own employees to manufacture a safety crisis in order to bypass a dormant demolition clause in my client's commercial lease." The room went dead quiet. The only sound was the sharp rustle of paper as Harrison rapidly flipped through the highlighted registry documents. I turned my gaze to Sterling. I was hard on the world, stripping away his leverage with clinical precision. "If this shutdown order is not immediately rescinded, we will file a formal referral with the state prosecutor's office today, including this evidence of corporate fraud, and let them decide how to proceed." Sterling's face flushed a dark, angry red. He looked at his attorneys, but they were staring at the irrefutable evidence, completely outmaneuvered. The systemic trap he had built had just been turned into a guillotine over his own neck. Harrison cleared his throat, looking highly uncomfortable. "Given the documented evidence of a severe conflict of interest, the city cannot uphold the emergency shutdown. The order is fully rescinded. Miss Taylor, your occupancy rights remain completely intact." Sterling slammed his hands flat on the table, leaning forward aggressively. "This is a technicality. I still own the building. When that lease expires in 6 months, I am throwing you out on the street." Astrid finally spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She used her own professional power, executing the final move without needing me to speak for her. "You won't have to," Astrid said, pulling a separate, perfectly formatted document from her leather bag and sliding it across the table. "This is a formal notice of intent to purchase. The property has a right of first refusal clause built into the original deed, granting the current commercial tenant the right to match any external development offer before the lease expires. I secured the small business financing yesterday." She looked Sterling dead in the eye, utterly dominant. "I am buying the building, Richard, at the assessed municipal value. You are going to sign the transfer of intent, or we proceed with the fraud referral." Sterling stared at the purchase agreement, entirely defeated. He had tried to crush her with bureaucracy, and she had used the very same system to buy the ground beneath his feet. Without a single word, he grabbed a pen, violently scratched his signature onto the agreement, and stormed out of the room, his attorneys scrambling quickly behind him. The predatory contract was scrapped. The threat was permanently neutralized. I closed the manila folder. The definitive snap of the cardboard echoed in the quiet room. 2 days later, the Coastal Bookstore was operating at full capacity. The yellow notices were completely gone from the glass, replaced by the brilliant afternoon sunlight reflecting off the coastal water. I stood by the front register, wearing a casual sweater instead of my usual tailored suit. I was holding a heavy ceramic mug of dark pour-over coffee. The chaotic, relentless pace of my corporate life in the city felt a million miles away, replaced by the grounded, steady rhythm of this space. Elias walked past us, carrying a massive stack of new hardcovers. He paused, looking at the clear glass door, then gave me a slow, approving nod. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud to see that door clean today, Astrid," Elias said quietly, before heading toward the local history section. Astrid finished ringing up a customer, the vintage brass register chiming cheerfully. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A secure message from Sarah flashed on the screen. The municipal clerk stamped the deed transfer. The registry is updated. It's officially hers. I showed the screen to Astrid. She looked completely different. The heavy, suffocating exhaustion had lifted, leaving her eyes bright and entirely clear. "The building is officially mine," she breathed, leaning against the wooden counter. "Congratulations," I said, meaning every syllable. "You fought a hard war." "I had an excellent strategist," she replied, her voice dropping into a softer, more intimate cadence. She reached under the counter and pulled out a small, heavy brass key. She set it on the polished wood between us. "What is that?" I asked. "It's the key to the second-floor office," Astrid said, looking directly into my eyes. She wasn't offering a vague, romantic declaration. She was offering a concrete, practical reality. The space has been empty for years. It has a dedicated phone line, strong Wi-Fi, and a view of the ocean. I need a commercial tenant to offset the new mortgage. And I happen to know a corporate lawyer who hates his commute and needs a reason to stay out of the city. I looked at the brass key. It wasn't just a lease. It was an invitation to build a life that actually fit both of us. It was a tangible, undeniable choice. "I want you here," she added, her voice dropping, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "On purpose, not as a favor." I didn't hesitate. I set my coffee mug down, reached across the counter, and picked up the key. The metal was cold, but the weight of it in my palm felt like absolute safety. "I moved my remote days to the coast," I said, my voice steady, matching her practical tone and laying out the concrete logistics of our future. "I'll take the upstairs office 3 days a week on paper and in practice." We filed the standard commercial lease by Friday morning. Off-campus stays off-campus, but here, we build the business. Astrid smiled, a wide, genuine expression that lit up her entire face. She reached out, her hand covering mine, her fingers wrapping warmly over my knuckles. It was a public, undeniable claim. "Are you working late again tonight, counselor?" she asked softly, the scent of sea salt, old paper, and good coffee surrounding us. I looked down at our joined hands, feeling the empty, burned-out void in my chest finally close completely. The biting, salt-heavy fog that had choked the coastline on my first morning here was entirely gone. The heavy oak door held only brilliant, unhindered sunlight, now no yellow paper, no threats, just clear glass. I replied, "Just waiting for you." I learned that true strength isn't about isolating yourself to survive the storm. It's about finding someone you trust enough to hand them a shield. Real love isn't built on dramatic rescues. It's built on consistency, shared respect, and doing the practical work to keep each other safe. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.